The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Hey folks, greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain. Very nice to have Vincent Heeringa back on the show. How are you today?
Well, thank you, Paul. It's always nice to be here.
Yeah, look, I'm really looking forward to having a chat to you today. We've got some pretty interesting topics, I got to say. So the title I know that's gone out on some of the streams begins with Techwreck, because there's a whole lot of stuff that's a bit crazy this week. We've got Twitter and Elon to chat about.
Mm-hmm.
We have Intel going through some challenges around staffing with a 20% drop in their revenues. We've got Apple imposing what some are calling a new Apple tax. I
think we got Meta and Freefall.
Meta, yep. It's a bit crazy at the moment. So,
it is. Ford closing down some of their autonomous vehicle experiments.
Yeah, rather expensive experiments, $2 billion US invested there. But before we jump in, remind listeners where you fit into this big wide world of podcasting, media, tech.
Okay,
I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, thanks for having me on the show again. And yes, I'm part of your whānau because my podcast, This Climate Business, is in your stable of shows, and that's a show about climate and business. Funnily enough, you might guess it from the title, actually. So I've had a long interest in media. I love innovation. I love talking to entrepreneurs and innovators. So that show is about turning the climate crisis into opportunity, because the shift from a fossil fuel extractive economy to a regenerative, low emissions economy, a green economy, it's very exciting, and there are lots of opportunities in there. I'm an investor in a venture capital fund that is all about that. And also a part owner and co-founder of a media business called The Feed, which is about the future of food.
Awesome. I love it. All these futurist topics, that definitely gets me going.
Better at the future than I am at the present, it must be said. But any minute now, I'll hit the jackpot.
Now, we should thank our show partners for the great job that they do of getting behind the show and making New Zealand Tech Podcast possible. So thank you to Vodafone, Spark, 2 Degrees, HP, Gorilla Technology, and Deal for their support of the New Zealand Tech Podcast and the broader New Zealand tech and innovation ecosystems. Now, in terms of news coming through, a little bit hard to decide what to tackle first, but probably Intel's ongoing challenges is quite a big deal. A 20% drop in year over year revenue for their last quarter. So that's fallen to $15.3 billion US dollars, and look, that was sort of where it was expected to be, but it really puts Intel into a very, very challenging position, because there's also this slowdown and people buying their PCs and laptops. Of course, Apple have moved away from Intel, so their slice of the market, which was in the past helping Intel, any market share that Apple have on that front hurts Intel now.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's this ongoing potential for much more of the industry to move away from Intel chips. That they are sort of sitting there with the changes in the US, where Biden's looking to ensure that future microchip manufacture happens as much as possible on US shores. So they're looking to take advantage of that in terms of take some of those US government funds to build their own fabrication plants. But how that actually plays out is I think is far from a done deal.
Yeah, and Intel are not alone in experiencing pain. I mean, we're going to talk about Meta. We're going to talk about Ford in a minute. On in regards of share price, all the tech companies are experiencing quite a lot of pain at the moment as share markets kind of reflect the economic reality of a downturn. Kind of coming at both ends, isn't it? There's a supply issue just around actually materials going into chip manufacturing, and this is a squeeze globally. But you've also got this downturn in the economy, fueled probably more than anything else than by inflation. Taking the cost of living up really high for people, and so upgrading their tech, into the latest gear. Or entering the market as a young person has become so much more expensive. And so that's having quite an effect on demand. And so the tech companies are kind of getting squeezed on both ends. The supply side, labour markets, materials, shipping, logistics, still quite tough. And you've got the demand side, affected by a major war in Europe. And even if it's actually not that major a war, it is having a big psychological effect. And then the real thing is the cost of living.
Yeah, and it's really widespread. But I guess Intel have been, we look at the sort of the Metas and Microsofts and Googles who have been doing these maybe more quiet layoffs where they're not necessarily announcing something to the share market and so on, publicly, but in the background are also, either freezing hiring or laying off numbers of people. But of course, Intel almost kind of looks like they're on their way out.
Do you really think so? That's quite a big call, Paul, because their technology has been so dominant in anything other than Apple for so long. Do you think there's more than just an economic downturn? Do you think there's some technology issue there with their performance?
They have had issues over quite a number of years, and so what they used to do to sort of iterate their chips, they had this sort of TikTok method where 1 year they would bring in sort of big changes to their chips. The next year would be more sort of incremental, and as part of that process, they were basically moving to smaller and smaller dies for their chips. So we had these chips that kept shrinking. Now, Intel used to always lead the way on that front. Now they're the ones that are on the back foot, so they haven't been able to keep up with the rest of the sector, and that's hurt them. And then they've had a lot of competition from AMD in terms of making those.
Yeah, that's right.
Intel, the 64-bit chips. I think actually you give some credit to AMD on the way that these chips work today. But they've had a lot of competition now. To a degree, Intel has come back in the last little while in terms of their competitiveness with AMD, and we see headlines around that actually Intel have got the best options and the best bang for buck, which is probably similar to what happened the last time I decided to buy some stock in AMD, and then Intel gave them a big swift punch, and AMD kind of went back to the trenches for a few years with a sort of smaller share. But the bigger question is whether Intel chips are broadly on their way out, and then it comes down to, well, how does Intel make its money in the future through making chips for others, and they're just in the process, I think, of spinning off their autonomous driving technology. So that's getting a listing. So there's different things that they're relying on, but they're hoping that spin-off is going to give them the funding for building the new plants. Right. But already the numbers what they're expecting that to attract are much, much lower than what they were anticipating.
Yeah, sure. So it's a
probably
rotten
year
time
ago.
to be launching something. Where do the Chinese go for their chips?
Well, I guess you look in your devices. You've got Samsung, TMSC, Taiwan, and Intel. Those are kind of I think the three probably biggest players. If I haven't got mixed up and left somebody out.
Given you've got the world is sort of fracturing into kind of trade blocks. Do you think that China eventually will have its own tech that will run quite independent of the American and Taiwanese chips?
Well, that's what they were trying to do up until in recent weeks, where the US basically came out and said, if you're American working in this space in China, then you need US government approval to actually carry out that work. Otherwise, you potentially lose your US citizenship or be in some sort of pretty deep legal hot water. So what we saw was this massive resignations in China, and without that expertise from the US, very hard for China to actually grow their capabilities on their ability to sort of innovate and produce microchips.
Surely it must be matter of time for China to catch up, and not short of their own talent base.
They've been quite a long way behind. Maybe a decade or so sort of behind in terms of their tech. So the sort of chips coming out of China pretty poor. We heard about Russia not being able to get latest computer processors and so on, and their only option being some pretty rank chips out of China that were the bits and pieces I read suggested their performance is just an absolute joke.
Sure.
And failure rates of a third to a half. So just really, really poor.
Yeah, they're going to run out of.
So there's a bit of a journey there for China. As you say, China, they're usually very good, and they will usually get there. And like we're now seeing in sort of auto manufacturing and so on, they get to a point where actually they're incredibly competitive. They make a very good product, I would expect the auto industry, over the next decade to be. Just to look completely different.
I think the curve's inevitable. It's got a predictability about it in the same way that Japan, Taiwan, even European countries, they do catch up. Anyway, we better go on with other news.
Yeah. So a few other things that sort of cross in there. We've got just, I guess, a couple of local things to chat about before we get back in and thread some of these pieces back together. There's been a bit of coverage and stuff today locally around a suggestion that New Zealand needs a cyber minister.
I saw that. What do you think?
As we see cyber attacks sort of ramp up. Well, it's interesting. Australia have this role, and what we saw with the recent attack over there, which hit Optus as major telco, was the minister really came down hard on them, and I've seen all sorts of coverage, and it seems like with this, and it's not just this role, but we've got the government holding, in this case, Optus to account at a level probably we haven't seen before, when you've got government basically calling out one of the biggest businesses in the country quite publicly and saying, hey, you've really stuffed up. And in the past in New Zealand we've had varying people such as myself who kind of bang their fist on the table across varying media and make a bit of a noise when we see shocking things happen, like the attack on the Waikato DHB and the amount of data that was leaked there. So can a cyber minister help? I would tend to think so, actually. I don't know how many ministers that we have now and how many is kind of the right number. But even if it's for, a window of time to change the tide, because what I feel in New Zealand is we do pretty poorly from a cybersecurity perspective. We're just not operating at the level we should be. There isn't legislation there that puts an onus on on directors and businesses and organisations to step up. So when something happens like what we saw with Waikato DHB or Pinnacle Health recently and so many others, there doesn't tend to be a huge consequence unless that organisation loses a huge amount of money off the back of it directly.
And I got two thoughts on this, if I'm allowed a word in, because it's quite hard to get a word in edgewise with you, Paul. When you do get on the
you are 100% right, Vincent.
Right. Well, if it's for what it's worth, I would support. If I was given the chance to support or not, who cares what my opinion is? But we need a cyber security minister for the simple reason that the first role of a government is protect citizens. That's why we have a justice system, why we have a police, why we have an army, and why we have 2 planes in our Air Force. So protecting citizens these days is more than just a physical requirement. It's also a digital requirement. I don't think I need to make that case to you or to our audience. But so in principle, that is a good role for a state to fulfill. And if you're worried about too many ministers, maybe it needs to be like your wardrobe, sort of one in, one out, to keep the numbers level. But the second thought, as I read this, I thought actually that, the very first thing a cyber minister should do is eat his own or her own dog food. And before they...
Explain that for people that aren't familiar with the term.
Many of the breaches that we see happen are in government departments or in government entities, and our state is digitally leaky. And so before a minister got involved in telling business how to operate, I would think maybe the first 2 to 5 years, who knows, just choose a number, ought to be on increasing the safety, security and the practice of government data, of public data. And let's face it, that would be the majority, because the state in New Zealand is large. It occupies something like 40% of GDP. I'm not quite sure about that, but we know that the amount of activity in New Zealand by the state is huge. The amount of data, and quite important data, as you say, around health, around education, around justice, all that data is owned by the state. And so I think the very first thing to earn any credibility a cyber minister would need to do is fix our state services in regards to cybersecurity.
Good call. That's I'm curious how folks that are responsible for these different entities would feel about that. But I think it's fair to say it's quite variable across the different government entities, because there are so many entities that are effectively government entities. And we see a lot of variability. I think some of them do a really, really good job, but then we see other areas for all sorts of reasons that lack the process, lack the commitment in terms of funds and so on. So and I don't think it's not sort of super simple to figure out, but that's why that's why you get someone into this sort of role. Now, just I guess slightly tied in with that, talking about privacy and cybersecurity. This story came through last week from Pod News, which is probably the biggest news outlet sort of globally that focuses on the podcasting world. Around MediaWorks Rover podcast app. Now, this app has been doing something pretty dodgy, but none of the media have sort of picked up on it in New Zealand. Now, I don't know whether that's because a reasonable chunk of the media in New Zealand is MediaWorks, or that it's that other media don't want to step on MediaWorks' toes. Maybe they haven't got their houses in order. I'm not sure. But the Rover podcast app, and it's something they've been promoting heavily over the last few years.
Yeah.
For listening to their radio stations and to their podcasts. If you're running it on Android, has been leaking a whole lot of data, basically passing it back to the podcast publisher. So when you download a podcast episode, usually the data that goes to the podcast hosting service is something as simple as a URL for the file that's needed, right? That's the audio file. So when you download NZ Tech Podcast, you hit play or you hit download or you subscribe through your podcast app. That app usually would to the server say, hey, I need blah, 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 .com/blah, NZ Tech Podcast, maybe it's 601.mp3, and that's the file. Now, what MediaWorks app Rover has been doing has been doing that, but after it, putting a little question mark and then filling that with data, which is a very common scenario on how these things happen, confirming to the podcast host, the app version that's being run, whole pile of other data that just happens to include down to 4 digits, a GPS longitude and latitude of the user and a unique identifier for that user so that they can be, continuously tracked over a period of time.
Quite handy for advertisers to geolocate so they can, send you that the whiskey ad just at the time of day and location that you want it.
Yeah, so usually what an advertiser will get is an IP address, which gives some information about locality.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we expect is they get the what the file is that you want and the IP address, and then at the time on the fly, the podcast host can generate a custom version of that podcast with inserted advertising based on where that IP address is. So if that's an IP address from New Zealand, then it can drop in some New Zealand advertising, and we certainly see that on a fair number of podcasts. Now, what this to me sort of suggests a couple of things. One, this is the sort of data probably that MediaWorks themselves have and maybe are keeping to keep track of things, and that they're not doing a very thorough job of looking at user privacy when this is what is actually being passed back to everyone. My guess is they want this data for themselves, sure, and that's okay as long as they actually specify that in their privacy policy, which they haven't done. So they've been getting themselves into a bit of hot water on that front, but then they've gone further than just taking that data for themselves. They've shared it out based on whatever podcast you're listening to and handed it back. Now,
there's a couple of thoughts on this. I mean, they asked Pod News actually asked MediaWorks for a response, and they didn't deny that was a possibility for publishers to know. And in fact, it seems like it's a deliberate decision to include that data, just from what I saw. And it's worth just pointing out that Apple users have the option to turn that location data off. It's still within the Apple universe. There's a permissions setting, isn't there?
And on Android. I guess that what happened here was the Apple, if you're using the Apple app, it wasn't giving any of this stuff. It was running as you would expect.
That's right, because the default option is
only the regardless of what you set your phone to.
I see.
So this, but both of these was regardless of. Yeah. To a large degree, obviously, if you turn your location off, it's not going to be able to forward back an accurate, GPS longitude or latitude.
Yeah.
And it would be very unusual for this level of data to get passed back. But reading the response from MediaWorks, I think they've addressed it and pushed out a new version of the app.
In the new version, kind of, from what I can see here, the app released on 30th September is an approximate location accurate to within 3-kilometre square radius has now been rolled out as a forced update to prevent tracking the precise location of users. The value here for the media company is that if you own a billboard company, such as MediaWorks does, you can triangulate the messaging that you organise between a phone, an individual, and your billboard to really optimise the advertising that goes to that individual. This already happens, by the way. It's not unique to Rover in the sense that a company like Reach Media is able to basically use a kind of mosaic of census data along with NZ Post's actual mosaic database to more or less tell you what kind of people are driving past what kind of billboard. And it's actually not dissimilar to within a 3-kilometre radius because they know, kind of where they live. And by triangulating kind of cell phone data, census data, and a billboard location, you can get quite specific in serving ads to those. And where that works incredibly well is in a retail setting where time of day, kind of demographic, and the location of a burger chain nearby or a local warehouse, you can be very specific with your advertising.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that this technology can be used well and can be used to do good things, but when it's accidentally, as in this case, being passed off to, parties that weren't disclosed.
Yes.
And look, as you say, there's 2 updates. So one update that they've just done since the story broke in the last few days, which is to stop sending all this data. And then there was the update on September the 30th, which meant even though it's showing longitude and latitude to 4 digits, now it's not actually, even though it's giving that much data, it's already anonymized, to that what is it, 3-kilometre radius and so on.
Yeah.
So I just think, some of this technology, can be used well, but when you, as it looks like they were before September 30th, basically you listen to that podcast on a particular date and they've got a GPS location, they could map it out and go, oh, here's Paul at this address listening to your podcast at this time and so on. And you haven't been told that. That seems pretty dodgy to me.
That seems a little dodgy, but in principle, is it any different from being sent specific ads based on your search behaviour?
Look, I got no problem with the ad side of it, right? But it's that privacy piece, and then what happens with that when it's undisclosed. So that's why when I go to say the New Zealand Herald and it's trying to get my location, I'm okay for them to know I'm in Auckland, but I don't need them to get a map of every story that I, or whatever news site, right? Now, obviously, if you're a subscriber to that, then actually, as well as them getting money off you, they can actually, put all these bits and pieces of data together and collect data. So there's quite a few aspects to this that can play out, positively and, hopefully in terms of giving us better advertising. But on the flip side, there are these privacy risks, right? And I think you've got to balance that, and we've got to be able to trust the entities that we work with, and Google are part of this because this app's been approved by Google, and Google said that it does certain things with the data through the Google Play Store, but actually that wasn't happening from an honest perspective. So,
but still, credit to MediaWorks, they responded and they fixed it at least to kind of what most people would regard as acceptable.
Yeah, yep. I think they're in a good place now with that. All right. Okay. On to other topics. Samsung. What on earth is going on at Samsung? I mean, this is something that's sort of been bubbling away for quite some time in terms of the grandson of Samsung's founder had got into some pretty deep hot water. Served 2 stints in jail on bribery charges. Was expecting him to be spending quite a large portion of time in the slammer.
Well, just read through the list of indictments, shall we?
If you've got it there,
because Lee Jae-yong is now been made executive chairman of Samsung, but here's his CV, which is impressive. And participate in an influence peddling scheme that helps oust a head of state, cop a 5-year jail sentence for bribery, be indicted for your role in a merger that cemented your power, further cloud your reputation by filing careless paperwork about your financial affairs. Take multiple doses of an anesthetic that has legitimate uses but is notorious for being abused in pursuit of certain exotic, intimate, personal experiences. I don't wonder what they are. Let's not go into that. And be appointed chair of the Earth's mightiest electronic company. So, a path to glory that is not, you'd say, littered with good works.
No, it just seems it's pretty hard to get your head around from my perspective. Now, we've read recently that this seems to actually be some sort of modus operandi of governments in South Korea that they pardon people for some pretty serious crimes who are able to help, I guess, generate revenue for the country and bump up the GDP or help it, go in a particular direction, and these criminal things don't really seem to matter. Do what you like if you run a mega, multi-billion-dollar business.
I'm going to draw a long bow with this, Paul. So, Joe Allen might actually turn the microphone off if I go too far. But Korea is one of the most hierarchical societies in the world, and there are some notorious failures, spectacular failures, that have happened as a result of poor leadership, coming directly as a result of that hierarchical, so the inability of young or people lower down the ranks to call out the BS or the failures of their leaders. Probably the 2 most notorious ones are the Korean airline 747 that flew into a mountainside, and the famous example that is in the book Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. And also the terrible drowning that happened a few years ago with a ferry, probably about 3 years ago, where the captain and all the crew were telling the passengers to stay where they are while the crew was jumping off the boat. And I can't help wonder if there's a connection between that kind of that subservient and hierarchical worshipping of those in authority and something like this, where a family has continued its dynasty even though it doesn't deserve it, continues to be reappointed in positions of authority.
Yeah.
Did you turn the microphone off, Joe Allen? No. Okay. Because I'm sure some of our Korean audience will put me right about this.
Yeah. I mean, I think this in itself is calling for there to be a whole podcast series on it. I mean, there must be so much that you could go into to delve into it. So I'm looking forward to the mini series or the something or other about it. But it's sort of, it's quite shocking to me. But there we go. That is the world in which we operate. And I actually happen to quite like a lot of the Samsung products, which makes it, it makes it harder, right? Because you could go, well, I shouldn't buy from this company or support this company, but you kind of look around at all the big companies.
Well, they do it well.
And there's always something that you can look at and go, that's kind of not the best, right? Every direction we look. In fact, we must talk about Apple at some stage. They've put in place a new tax on advertising, so in-app advertising now, and I don't know, tax is maybe an unfair word, but it sort of feels like a tax, right? And so last week, was it? Yeah, I think it was last week, Tuesday, New Zealand time. Apple quietly updated. This is reading from The Verge. Apple quietly updated its App Store rules to require that iOS developers use in-app purchases and thereby give Apple 30% on sales of boosts for posts in a social media app. And of course, the platforms that do these boosts is generally Facebook and Instagram. So you've got Apple basically asking for a handout, a cut, whatever you want to call it, of that revenue from Facebook, from Meta that owns Facebook and Instagram. This, while we've been hearing over a period of time around varying frustrations, the suggestions of sort of antitrust cases and so on around Apple and the cut that they already take through their App Store, which creates issues. For instance, if you want to sign up for Netflix, you won't see that option in the Netflix app on iOS anymore because Apple want their 30% cut on that. And so varying entities have found their ways around it, but Apple are kind of pushing forward and working out how they can take a bigger slice.
Well, they do it because they can, right? Corporates are without a moral compass, and so because they have created this walled ecosystem that many people enjoy, including me, do like the Apple world, and they have earned my trust and they've earned my business. But as a result of that, they have now created, the App Store, which is an incredibly successful marketplace, and they can dictate the terms. And that then comes with huge responsibility, right? They ought to be behaving in a better way, but they can't help themselves. And that's because companies, by their nature, are without a soul, without a conscience. And so if they can, they will. And I think you're absolutely right that there is a moment in which when market failure allows companies to be as dominant as Apple is, then there needs to be some sort of regulation. Or, is it regulation? Is it some sort of mechanism that forces better behavior out of Apple? And in some ways, we're kind of moving back to a feudal world where mercantilism rules. If you can put up a fence, you will, and charge people a toll as they go through. And it's not a government thing. It's just that you've managed to find yourself a piece of land that is a funnel and can control it. And when that harms a market, when that harms citizens, then it's time for a government to regulate. And I think Apple has reached that point.
Yeah, look, they have this incredible power. They have great products, which I don't think people are going to be stopping. In the same way people aren't going to stop buying Samsung products tomorrow. And this is not the sort of thing that really is going to make much difference from a consumer perspective. And in fact, you could say Meta is one of the most hated companies in the world over the last couple of years in some regards. So it's you can see why they make these moves.
Interesting times.
Yeah.
Shall we talk about Ford?
Sure. Let's talk about Ford. Argo AI was one of the companies that they invested in, along with I think Volkswagen also invested in Argo AI. But Ford had a very key stake in the firm, and this is the firm that we've sort of been watching for a little while amongst a number of other players. They probably weren't pulling the biggest amount of attention and headlines, but basically working away on autonomous driving systems, and so over $2 billion US dollars that Ford had put into Argo AI. It looks like that chapter is closing.
The size of the investment is eye-watering. $100 billion. $100 billion. That's more money than even you've got, Paul. Has been invested into the promise.
I could put together $100, but keep going.
Has been invested in the promise of level 4 autonomy, said CEO of Ford, Jim Farley, in a call. Yet no one has defined a profitable business model at that scale. And the issue is that it's just taking so long to get beyond kind of limited autonomy to this full-blown autonomy. And, there's really good reason for that. It's difficult for many, many reasons. And $100 billion seems like a lot of money, but that's kind of the scale of the hurdle that has to be overcome to get to fully autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen others, pull out. Uber were investing in this space, and they've stepped back from it. We see Waymo and a number of others that do have their autonomous and driverless vehicles on the roads, and in the US right now. There's that opportunity if you're in Los Angeles, if you're in San Francisco, if you're in Phoenix, and varying other parts of the world as well, where you can go and ride one of these vehicles. Now, that particular approach that Waymo and some of the others are taking is down a track where they've got things mapped to a meticulous sort of detail. And so their technology, you can't just say, oh, well, let's turn it on tomorrow in Auckland. They need to have that level of detail for it to operate and do a fair amount of testing. And maybe that's the technology we end up with, but then you've got the others. And I think this was the track that Argo were down, which is, developing a technology that, with its varying sensors and so on, would ultimately be able to operate anywhere without having to have this super level of detail and super expensive sensors in their vehicles. Eventually, their vehicles weren't low cost, but I think it's fascinating to hear that Ford have taken that track and are winding down Argo AI. It's a lot of money just to flush down the toilet, isn't it? But it would have no doubt cost them a lot more to keep it running.
It's interesting that this technology is not going to be the giant leap from one system to the other. It seems to be incremental. They talk about level 2 and level 3 autonomy are now being built into vehicles, and that's what you probably experience in your Tesla, Paul, is the ability to take your hands off the wheel for certain periods of time, even though there's still a requirement for you to probably have your hands on the wheel or have your eyes pointed in a particular direction, stops you falling asleep. Some technologies just make a giant leap. This one seems to be incremental, and it kind of reflects, I think, the complexity of two things. There's the technology itself, but there's a wider problem, which is the kind of legal and kind of, I suppose, human scale of the problem. The legal one is not is not a small problem around where does liability sit in case of accident. Is it the car company? Is it the software company? Is it the driver? Is it the insurance company? Is it someone that built the road? Is it the victim? And that legal miasma is going to take a long time to sort out, and it's probably going to take a lot of failures and accidents to actually establish what the precedent will be. So I think there's that. But then also I think there's just the, which way is going to emerge as popular. People like driving, and I think that humans will be reluctant to take their hands off the wheel. I think some will. But I actually think that there's a huge appetite for people participating in their driving experience, and they're not going to surrender, even though the technology might be safer, even though it might free you up to actually, do your doom scrolling on Facebook or whatever at the same time. I actually think people, they love the power that driving brings and the freedom that kind of implies. So I think there's more than just the technology to overcome.
You know, a lot of us, don't mind sitting on a bus. Don't mind sitting in a vehicle where somebody else is in control, or
Not
sitting
many, given New
in
Auckland's problems with traffic.
or sitting in an aeroplane and so on. So, look, yeah, I mean, I think people will expect to have that option for probably maybe forever, right?
But it's interesting that it's an incremental change. It's not like I was going to pick up my phone, but the phone was like boom, it was there. The
Well,
smartphone.
see, this is where I would disagree with you, Vincent, because I think most of our technological changes are incremental over time, but then something flips. Now, whether that's from a marketing perspective, whether that's just a product that's that we click onto, but the things that made the iPhone what it was, most of them were actually around and evolving over a long period of time before, say, the iPhone came to market. And even when the iPhone came out, you couldn't copy and paste, you couldn't install your own apps. It was still incremental, turning that first iPhone into a good one. But I guess the point I would just add to your great commentary is that I think that the autonomous driving R&D that goes in is now kind of going to compete with itself. So let's say that, I don't know, in 3 years' time, Tesla finally get there and they've got their autonomous driving stack working, so you can go and sit in the back seat of your car, and you're allowed to take your hands off and so on potentially, or you can, it will let you do that.
Yeah.
They are going to be competing when we look at sort of legislation and so on. They're going to be competing not over how safe a car was, say, 5 years ago, but that technology that they've actually helped improve in terms of making driving safer. So as their level 2 and beyond sort of, technology gets better, driver assist type technologies, whether it's Teslas or Mercedes or, Fords and so on, as that gets better, then we actually raise the bar in terms of what we would expect of an autonomous, driving system.
Yeah.
And Musk, and we'll get to talk to him about him and Twitter in a minute.
Is he coming on the show? Fantastic.
I'll take your comments on Musk. But he talks about it being, multiple times better than what it is when we're driving. So then it's like, well, are you comparing a person driving with these driver assist systems, or are you talking about someone driving a 1980s car without airbags and XYZ?
Yeah.
So there's extra complication in there, and how you will measure that, and who is to blame, and there will be accidents and there will be deaths, and it's going to be very interesting. I think New Zealand has, I don't know if we have an opportunity, but in the same way that we saw companies like Whisk come here and sort of feel as though we had the right environment from a legal standpoint for them to test their autonomous air taxi. We had Google come here with Google Learn and test that stuff, in the early days. I think we should be creating an environment where those sort of companies can come here.
Yeah,
because we want that cutting edge R&D.
Just one more thought on that, if I may, since I got the microphone. There's a final twist to this, which I think has to do with the perversity of the philosophical position that these companies take, that they are still making vehicles for individual private use, when we know that the challenge is around mass transport and mode shift. And so we're still working on like-for-like replacements of ICE vehicles for one person to travel across town, occupying a huge amount of lane space, parking space, and so on. $100 billion is so much money to spend on that level of perversity, when what should be invested in, and where the problem actually exists, is figuring out how do we get people walking, cycling, taking mass transit in a way that's not currently dangerous, horrible, wet, annoying, sweaty, takes ages. That is the challenge that we should be focusing on. And the autonomous bit to me is, I think, sort of at a level of moral corruption that is typical of a broken way of thinking about societies, that we need to empower and liberate individuals to just go about their business. That is a bankrupt philosophy, and I would love to see $100 billion put into solving how do we get people places in climate friendly and in healthy ways, not clogging up motorways with metal boxes.
It's a very interesting perspective, and I wish we had another hour to delve into it. But folks that are interested in that topic can probably check out This Climate Business, and I'm sure you'll have some answers on the show. But before we and I want to hear a little bit from you around what's happening in that world. But before we do, we promise we're going to talk about Twitter and Elon.
Okay. Well, here's a quick segue into Twitter and Elon Musk. Elon Musk, unlike most of the other tech bros, actually is committed and is showing us a masterclass on how to address the really big issues around climate. And if it wasn't for him challenging the auto industry, we would be continuing to have this kind of incremental, piecemeal approach to moving towards EVs. It's thanks to his genius and his kind of these sort of once in a lifetime kind of freak of nature that has managed to shove a whole industry into the future. Long time overdue, but it's thanks to his pioneering that all the other auto companies are following in his footsteps.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you're right on that front.
And can we have a hyperloop? That would be awesome. A hyperloop to Tauranga, Hamilton, Taupo.
Well, there's this inconvenient thing sometimes, Vincent, that we have to deal with, is that someone has to pay for this stuff.
I bet you if we asked him, he would install it.
And I think that's where Elon's had some success with Tesla, is that people like to pay for that stuff and they're happy to pay for it for themselves.
Well, do you remember him offering to install a mega battery in South Australia? If he did it by a certain date, he would pay. I can't remember if he was going to pay for the whole thing, but he paid for it.
If he missed the deadline.
That's right. And he met the deadline, and good for them. They got a mega battery that has been incredibly helpful for them to migrating away from coal, also providing quite a lot of stability into their electrical grid in South Australia. Anyway, let's talk about Twitter.
So, what are your thoughts? You're reasonably active around the world of
I like Twitter
of Twitter, and you've been there a long time. I think
I have been since 2009. I've got about 4 followers, so it's been really successful for me.
You and me both.
I like it for a couple of reasons. I don't experience the kind of hate that people talk about, and I don't know if it's because I'm so dull that I just never manage to attract it. But I enjoy great conversations. We have good banter, and there are lots of japes and funny puns that I enjoy, and I learn some things too. So I've had lots of interesting links to research and so on that I've come across through Twitter. So, I like it. I would worry that because he's such a maverick, and he's such a maverick, and he seems to have bought this by accident. He's almost kind of like walked into an auction and put his, scratched his nose just at the wrong moment and bought this thing. And so, unlike Tesla and unlike SpaceX, I don't think there is a mission here. I think he's sort of backpedaling on a mission. So he's now talking about it as a marketplace of ideas. It's about free speech and so on. I think he's ended up by mistake, and he's having to kind of backfill the strategy to make it look like there's a sort of a direction of travel in it. And that kind of would worry me just as a user. But I suppose, who cares about me? What's more important is we know that disinformation has a powerful effect. It can move markets. It can change elections. And
all information can, right?
That's right. All information.
Right or wrong information has an impact, and that's why we
right.
have spin doctors. We have all these different sorts of things going on,
and that's been recognised for many years, and it's why we have in science a peer-reviewed science system, and it's why in media we have rules around defamation, and also media standards. And it kind of cracks me up that people pile into media, but they're very mainstream media. They're the ones who have the legal responsibility. They also have an ethics kind of board that they have to respond to. They have their own internal requirements of at least 2 sources before you publish. And yet on social media, it's Wild West when it comes to information. And, that was starting to be pegged back a bit by their own kind of, voluntary standards and so on. But social media still operates outside the realm of what other media have to, operate within. And so you've got to think, well, a maverick like this, is he just going to continue to abuse the privilege that they have, or actually is he going to bring some genius to it, as he has to other parts of his businesses?
Yeah, look, I mean, I wonder, how we apply that to media, because, do you allow 2 people to sit down and have a conversation about whatever they please to have, to have a conversation about? And
well, we don't actually.
And to share their views, No,
we don't, because we have rules about slander.
Of course, yeah. But
and those rules are there to preserve the reputation and just curb the natural tendencies that we have to hate on people, something that has been with us since Cain and Abel. So, but the social media businesses, for some reason, and we go into the long history of this, because it's been treated as data, not as information, have escaped the usual constraints that even this show, Paul, you have to operate a business that, apart from anything, pays tax, probably, unlike the others, the other social media giants, but also operates within a, rules around discourse.
Sure, and look, when as you say, there are laws of we've got things around defamation, incitement of violence, and so on, right? And those apply across a whole range of scenarios. So we've got those laws established. What I'm kind of curious about, I guess, is where Elon goes with how they will moderate it. And he said that they're bringing on board this content moderation council. He said it will not reinstate any accounts or make any major content decisions before that's convened. So to me, that seems like quite an important piece of the puzzle, is what do they land with there, and can they land on something that creates this sort of digital town square that he's talking about, and you think about in a normal town square, if someone's saying something that a lot of people don't agree with, then they might get themselves into a spot of bother and so on. So yeah, how do they draw these lines, and how will it play out?
But this doesn't not exist. Facebook have an ethics committee, don't they? They have a separate independent committee that is there to look at set the rules around content. Most let's choose something else. Any
I think you could
forum,
say Facebook have had an ethics scandal.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. That these entities are a rule unto themselves, and they don't get treated as publishers.
Yeah.
And if you're a publisher, you have the threat of defamation over you, and also breaching media standards that you all subscribe to. I don't agree that there is no town square for debate. I think the town square has been fractured a little, but there has never been more places for people to have discussion and debate.
Yep. No, that is true.
It has been fractured. I'll give you that.
Yeah.
And so if you decide to go down a YouTube rabbit hole, that is your lookout. And
there are a lot of rabbit holes you can go down.
Actually,
not
I'm going
just YouTube.
I'm going to change my point of view on that. It is your fault, and you are manipulated by the algorithms that are designed to are rage machines that are specifically designed to reward you for your rabbit holiness.
Very good.
Unlike the media, mainstream media, which continues to plod along, losing money, but doing God's work.
So everyone should go and watch The Social Dilemma, just so you get a little bit of a view on these things.
Yeah,
you must have seen
fantastic.
it. Yeah. So we'll leave that on that front. Now, before we wrap up, I'm just keen to hear from you, Vincent, as host of this climate business. What has been happening in your world and in this world of climate and business?
Great. All right. Well, thank you for asking, Paul. Slightly different take on technology, but just bear with me. If you look at any curve of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it looks similar to a kind of exponential curve. It tracks along for 10,000 years and then suddenly has this fantastic spike. And the challenge that we've got is now there is so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we have to draw down. So it's not just enough now to offset. So, you might drive home in your gas guzzling Tesla. I'm sure it's not gas guzzling, but anyway, you get my point. You eat a steak, you plant a tree.
Power it by coal.
These offsets don't work anymore because there is now so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We actually have to draw it down, and there's lots of investment going into drawdown technology. Carbon dioxide extraction attracts billions of dollars, and it's a manifest failure because it's really difficult. It's a very difficult gas to suck out and turn into a solid that could be buried or into a fuel that could be reburned or whatever. There is a technology that
trees.
I'm coming to it. Sorry. Just steady on. There is a technology that works incredibly well, and New Zealand is in a unique place to do it. And I know this because I interviewed Tim Flannery, who is Australia's kind of default climate commissioner and a leading voice in it, Australian of the Year in 2007, and an authority on climate change. And Tim Flannery pointed out that New Zealand has these wet, temperate forests. So it's more than trees, it's forests. And these forests exist in only in a fraction of our country because 85% of them are cleared for eating yummy steaks and growing wool, etc. And actually, we have a technology here that we could grow and act as a very powerful carbon drawdown machine. And the challenge in all of this, Paul, is that at the moment, no one is incentivized to plant, maintain, and look after forests. And there's a huge amount of effort going on in science and the finance community to figure out how can you as an entrepreneur, as a landowner, as someone that cares about this stuff, be rewarded for restoring and encouraging nature-based solutions. And I know we're slightly off topic because we're not talking tech now, but it's really interesting to me that $100 billion can be invested in more individual cars driving around the city, and sweet, 2/5 of sweet Fanny Adams gets invested in nature-based solutions. And there is a solution that's staring us in the face, and we have the unique ability to contribute as a country. Anyway, that's what's been obsessing me this week.
That sounds pretty interesting. So now, folks that are wanting to kind of keep up a bit more on what's happening on the climate front, where do they find your show?
So easy to find on all podcast platforms. It's called This Climate Business, and it's kind of in the name. It's Climate Business. And Paul, I'm proud to announce this week will be the 100th episode.
Oh, congratulations, Vincent!
Thank you, mate.
Well done.
Well, thanks for your
100 episodes.
Thanks for your support. Yeah,
that's really awesome. Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening in. We've probably run a little over time, so we will wrap up there.
Only 12 minutes over.
Some really good discussion. So yeah, thanks very much, Vincent.
Thanks for the opportunity, Paul.
Great to catch up again. Always good to have you on the show. And yeah, folks, go and look up Vincent and look up This Climate Business, and also the feed if you want to follow what the future of food is. So thanks again to our show partners, Vodafone, 2 Degrees, Spark, HP, Gorilla Technology, and deal. That's us for this week. Catch you again next week. See ya.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.